So, Ali, if I start with you, Alexandra Kenefick is a PhD candidate at Concordia University, Montreal, in the independent interdisciplinary program INDI. Her research focuses on the intersection of feminist design and ethics in meat consumption, production politics, and emphasizes the materiality of meat through making and embodied experience, and exposing meat's complex narratives through feminist design. Through her scholarly and creative work, she hopes to spark deeper inquiry into the profound and contentious thing that is killing and eating other animals, and how the subtleties of individual response can persuade the momentum of great change. So, Ali, if you'd like to give your presentation.
Sure, yeah. I kind of have it written up here. So if you've seen the film, apologies if this kind of repeats things, but here she is. So my doctoral research creation thesis, Making Meat Matter, asserts that design is deeply integral to the human construct and conceptualization of the built and unbuilt environment, reified as it is in the products, services, architectures, and technologies that become inextricably entangled in the complexities of nature, culture, society, and place. As a result, design, nature, culture, society, and place become mutually constitutive. This project is chiefly concerned with the co-constitutive mechanisms at play between Western design, industrialized meat, and their shared roots in the ethos of Western modernism, which is informed by a patria-Eurocentric logic and a universalistic, white, anthropocentric worldview. We can see design in the influences of modernism in the minute details and the grand gestures of the industrial animal agricultural complex, from farm equipment, knives and guns, to the designs of assembly lines, transport vehicles, packaging, hamburger patents, and even advertising. Unfortunately, modernism's myopic worldview reduces the complex ethico-political problems of producing and consuming meat into constrained categories that are alleviated only by the sophisticated solutions of expert producers, which might be the formally educated designers, scientists, doctors, engineers, etc., and the expert consumers, which would be the wealthy and the educated, who buy them. Through design, modernism's strategy to hierarchize the material and immaterial world has been assisted by the development of oppressive tools and languages designed to fragment and distance humans, other animals, materials, and environments into categories. This has resulted in an exploitative culture that reduces these bodies into objects, resources, and metaphors for use and consumption by the ruling class. These figurative and literal tools and languages have been key to the success of the industrialized food system, normalizing oppressive procedures in the raising, killing, and eating of other animals, and inspiring competition and dominance in the commoditization of meat. Should we aspire to a more just multi-species coexistence where other humans, animals, and environments are not pawnable products or absent reference, I argue that the designs of such devices require serious interrogation. Unfortunately, industrialized meat and the mechanisms of modernism have become so deeply embedded into our collective contemporary way of life that these destructive devices have long gone hidden and unattended. However, modern meat's devastating effects are becoming increasingly palpable, with more and more attention being summoned to concerns surrounding global food security, climate change, public health, and food's classist attachments to racism and sexism. In short, it's become an overwhelmingly complex and wicked problem that has left consumers either paralyzed and/or ambivalent in the face of impending crises. So my work recognizes that too often the scale and scope of the industrial animal agricultural complex and its devastating effects far exceeds the realities of consumers' daily lives. Nonetheless, it also recognizes the significance of consumer agency, the power of subtle transition, mindfulness, and that everyday people are the designers of their everyday lives. In response, my project, Making Meat Matter, is interested in facilitating space for consumers to become physically closer and better acquainted with the subject of meat in order to establish their relationships with it and to uncover new forms of agency, feelings, and ideas towards it. So my project does this by inviting groups of diverse participants to multi-sensory makerspaces as a means to activate thinking on the subject of meat through simple creative activities that allow these participants to experience meat in material, emotional, embodied, and artistic ways, focused on freedom of expression and collaboration. Each makerspace features no or low-tech art making, crafting, and cooking activities featuring meat for members of my local community, including non-human animals. Placing participants with meat out of context of daily buying and eating is intended to be jarring so as to activate new modes of thinking through materiality and making. This project attempts to de-hierarchalize design by using it and its tools as a space and means for co-creation, rather than as just a procedure for elites to manufacture commodities for needy consumers. By recognizing all contributors and contributions as meaningful and valuable, and by allowing collective political agency, democratic pluralism, innovation, inspiration, and the flight of imagination to take place, we might then rediscover power and reinvent how it's used. So in line with Donna Haraway, it's a project that invites worlding rich with the potential for more responsive intervention, invention, and speculation. It's a project that's supposed to challenge design's canonical framework of what problems are, what is considered design, and who is considered as a designer. It also contests the norms behind killing and eating other animals, and hopefully invites curiosity and greater mindfulness in its audiences. And that's my spiel.
Wonderful, thanks very much, Ali. And now we go to Emilio. Give a quick introduction. Emilio Chapela is a PhD candidate at the University of Plymouth, a visual artist and researcher with a background in science, sculpture, and moving images. His work explores connections between science, technology, and ecology through art practice by examining notions of time and space as manifested through forces such as rivers, astronomical phenomena, light, gravity, rocks, plants, and volcanoes. He has had several museum and gallery exhibitions in Mexico, USA, and Europe, and he is curator and artist of Entrerios.net, an online community coordinated through the arts and dedicated to the well-being of bodies of water and hosted by the University of Essex. And Emilio, if you'd like to now tell us your recap of your research presentation.
Sure. I think, well, I'll start to say that the video presentation I prepared for the symposium, it's a good example of what we were discussing in the session earlier about diffraction, because it is a story of failing, but it's not, I don't see it as a critique to myself, you know, as a reflective critique to myself, but a sort of like a diffraction from where things emerge and where change and transformation on my thinking emerged. So I think it's a great example of diffraction, but it's also, I mean, it's also good to know for me that all that reading of Karen Barad is you know is coming is worth it. So I'll just give a brief story. It's a small story, so I'll just summarize. So back in 2017, I traveled with a group of people I didn't know to witness a total eclipse of the sun in the US. While my research at the moment was related to astronomy, and it was localized in two astronomical observatories in Mexico, in top of a mountain. Nonetheless, I went to this trip, and I had already spent 2 years like reading about new materialism and about Karen Barad and Manuel de Landa and many others. And the thinking was already there. It was already doing things to my work. And the research I'm talking about is my PhD in Plymouth. So that was related to astronomy, but in one specific mountain. That later changed, and now this presentation it's going to become part of the research. But this new materialism and this idea of a comprehensive view of the world was already emerging through my practice. So during the eclipse, I wanted to consider different angles. I wanted to consider different temporalities and move across different spaces. And so I had different cameras, and so I made all these sort of like thinking of how I would record, but I couldn't came with a plan. So at the end, it was about recording everything I could, and I mean, you can tell from the video that I was I got sort of confused by trying to do a lot technically. And so I spent most of the time of the clips trying to switch from one camera to the other. And I had the feeling when the eclipse was over that I missed it and that I spent like an entire trip for nothing. And but I guess that was sort of like my plans, my sense of control that was, you know, like was saying you didn't get it right. And so I guess that's part of the learning. And at the end, I think I will just add that yeah, for me at the very end, I noticed that I was really transformed by the phenomena, and that I could understand an eclipse as a more than planetary event where many things participated, like my beliefs, the trust I have in science, but also the affect, the body that remembers my childhood experience from another eclipse. So it was very intense, and this I relate with the thinking of Bergson as in terms of experience, not so much about the thinking spatially about time, but thinking about time from the experience of time, of duration. And so it relates with, the project relates with those ideas, Bergson's ideas. And finally, I think that one of the most important things is that realizing that these sort of complex in human and non-human entanglements, more than planetary entanglements, constituted sort of like a form of touching the world, that it wasn't about really representing, but about being touched in a sort of a multi-layered form of touching. And I think that's what Karen Barad means by meeting the universe halfway, you know, in terms of not being able to apprehend it completely or represent it, of course, but to sort of engage and touch it. So that's the story that the video tells, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you both for your great introductions, and also thank you both for your wonderful video presentations too. They're really, really, really interesting and rich and deep, both of them. And I'd just like to invite you to a conversation now with each other. If you have any kind of thoughts or questions for each other about the practice research that you've seen.
Yeah.
You want to start?
I can start.
Okay.
First of all, Emilio, I really enjoyed your video. I watched it a number of times. There's so much subtlety in it that I had to kind of watch it to sort of catch these different elements and then sort of piece them all together. I like the way it was shot too. There was sort of like an eerie quality to it where you as the viewer, you're sort of left to wonder. And I think that's sort of what you were trying to convey in your work. I kind of put up a few like questions, comments, like that I just jotted down while I was watching. So I don't know, we can maybe start there. So I'll just pick one. So one of the key themes that I observed from your video was of divides. In particular, the film begins with you trying to capture the eclipse on film, but there's a struggle to document the event in an attempt to attain like an objective or quantifiable experience. Meanwhile, while the equipment gives you hassle, you're frustrated with the inability to simply like enjoy the eclipse for its wonder and awe. So I see the classic Cartesian Newtonian divide between objective and quantitative experience, and maybe the difficulty of knowing how to approach the phenomena as the sky and celestial bodies through like a more qualitative experience. when quantitative reasoning fails or fails to make sense. So I kind of sense this sort of this struggle that you were sort of trying to see how you could experience it qualitatively, meanwhile still facilitating like your end goal of quantifying it. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's relates a lot with also with what I was saying about Bergson and the idea of especially understanding time not as a spatial sort of quality that you can divide and fragment but time as experienced in a very really complex way. And but I don't know, there's also very it's interesting, it's an interesting sort of observation and question, because I wonder if it would be possible for example to science, it's something that interests me to science to approach a phenomena from this sort of more comprehensive perception of events, and that's something that interests me. Sure, I think art is a good place to do that, no? But I also wonder if, for example, I'm very interested in how science and art can collaborate to sort of perhaps do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess maybe your work kind of inspired me to sort of delve into quantum theory a little bit. So I was reminded of philosopher Harry Hartshorne, who said physics describes but says nothing of the qualitative stuff. Meanwhile, quantum physics theorist Patrick Spott, if I'm saying that correctly, he speaks about the qualitative emergence, and that it's the presence of experiencing an object or a conscious mind, which would be you, that affects the determined reality. Therefore, like, I was kind of thinking this conscious mind with the observed object enable the emergence of the qualitative experience. So without you there participating with the phenomena, it doesn't happen. So I was thinking, because you referenced Karen Barrett, that is this maybe meeting the universe halfway looks like, where you have to participate through this qualitative phenomena of just emerging experience. I don't know, it was kind of fascinating to me.
Well, thanks. I think those references are really interesting, and yes, I think that meeting the universe halfway. I don't think that Karen Barrett says that we should get rid altogether of representations, or in that case, that if we can, you know, and I think that meeting the universe halfway, it really contains like this sort of interaction of various things, including ideas, discourses, representations, me being there with my will to record something, and with my biases, and so yeah, I guess everything participates, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like finding this balance between quantitative and qualitative, right? Because you have to sort of have both at some stage to sort of make sense of something. So yeah, it's just kind of how I was thinking about participation. Like, how do you participate with these things like time and eclipses when they're not really, as they can't really communicate with you, but they do in a different way. Yeah.
But there's this sort of quite famous situation that Bergson describes for when we see a shooting star, no? He puts that example in terms of a shooting star, the experience of seeing a shooting star. It has to be sort of taken in its entire intensity, while if you think about it as a rock flying in the space, like from point A to point B in space, for him at least, it's sort of like it's you know, it's less interesting, no? It's less interesting as a phenomena, and I do believe it's less interesting, but also science needs, I insist on that, you know, like perhaps there's some beauty as well on thinking about the rock flying from A to B, and yeah, so I think it's
yeah.
well,
I think there's definitely a poeticism there. There has to be. Do you have any questions for me about, I don't know, what you watched in my film?
Yeah, sure. I mean, perhaps some thoughts and ideas. I really enjoy that. It is really nice. I mean, I think the video, the practice is very humorous and quite, interesting in terms of what you're saying with that. And also, I find your research very interesting, and especially, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about, you speak about design, and obviously, when we consider all these things that interconnect, as you say, like everyone has a relationship to food, so pretty much everything is really interrelated, so it becomes really a challenge. But then I realize how the all the progress and the idea of capitalism really tries to invisibilize all that design, and these are huge things, you can see from the pictures that these are massive buildings that are pretty much, it's easy not to think about them and just eat, like you just, like you so clearly say. And so I was thinking a lot about the invisibility and the distance that we have to animals when they're directly seen as meat. Like you go to the supermarket and you really don't see any. There's a lot of distance, and that's very convenient, I guess, for industry. So that was the first thing that this sort of like very complex mechanism of invisibilization.
Yeah, and like I kind of picked that up too in your own work, is this is the distance, right? Like the divide or the invisible, the things we can't really see or understand. And so it's like, how do we narrow the distance, I guess? But it is something that like chiefly concerns me or fascinates me in my own research, is just that it's something we participate with every day, that it's so incredibly obvious to eat, to choose food, to consume it. But somehow through all of these grand mechanisms and like small details, industry and capitalism, whatever you want to call it, we've created this huge distance where we are so divorced from what we're actually consuming. And I think that when I talk about consumers, I think there's this sort of I guess, sort of like stereotypical view of what a consumer is. It's someone that's very materialistic, that goes out there, they spend their money, and it is. But I think essentially, because we all eat and must consume in this kind of economy, we are all consumers. And so like to consume something isn't just about eating, nor is it just about buying. It's about consuming the ethics that go with it, and the distance, and the way the whole thing has been put together. And yeah, it's about trying to figure out how do we make the invisible visible. And that's sort of what the point of the maker spaces are that are put together, sort of to try to activate people's thinking on like what they're eating, because it is so habitual. We just sort of stuff it in our face and we carry on with our day. And it's so easy. So like, why even bother thinking about it? But there's a lot at play underneath the surface. So
I think it's very interesting also. And I was also thinking about the Mexico, my sort of background, my culture, and it's sort of like the importance that food has. I mean, I'm not saying it's less or more important. It's just like trying to contextualize in Mexico, and I'm thinking it's also distance. The production is distance, but there's a lot of rituals around. I mean, there's many things that happen around food. I mean, it's really sort of like we're all the time thinking about what we're gonna have for dinner while having lunch, and who we're gonna meet, and it's always also about togetherness, but there's still distance for sure.
Yeah, and that's, I think, it's really problematic, because food is so like deeply embedded in our personal and collective our identities anyway, that you can't just say, well, this is ethically problematic, we'll just not do it anymore, which it would be kind of meat production, right? It's so problematic, but like meat in particular is so important to people's identity. Like, I think of all the different cultural cuisines around the world. I mean, if you just suddenly just got rid of meat, it would drastically change things. And I don't think it would go over very well with a lot of people either. They just wouldn't take it lying down. So it's a pretty sticky problem, because even when it is really obvious and like we put it in the center of our table and we gather around it, it's like, okay, well, how do I get rid of this without getting rid of a part of me or a part of where I come from? Or how do I change it, in a way that doesn't sacrifice other really important things? It's something. It needs, so there's no one solid answer.
It's very complicated. I agree, and I remember, like, watching your movie. I remember perhaps you have sort of a close relationship with this Haraway's quote, but I thought about bringing it here because I think it's very interesting. So she says, there is no way to eat and not to kill. No way to eat and not become with other material beings to whom we are accountable. No way to pretend innocence and transcendence or a final peace.
Yeah. Haraway, she's like my goddess. She's my Bible. I read her like so often. Sometimes I just read her just to read her, just because she just has such a poetic way of writing. But definitely that sentiment of this necessity of living and dying in life it resonated so powerfully with me and my work. Is just that I think particularly in the type of contemporary society that we live in, we walk on eggshells around ethics, and I think we should, of course, but to the point where causing harm and causing exclusion is so taboo that it becomes almost impossible to engage with the just basics of how to live and die correctly together. Is that we're so trying to make everything right about keeping everything alive that we forget that to eat and survive, things have to die, whether they're plants or animals. And I think it's less about trying to like pad things with styrofoam and be really careful, and more about trying to cultivate a sort of, I guess, ethical sense or responsible sense about how to die responsibly or kill responsibly. And I'm not advocating killing exactly, but I think it's obviously a necessary part of how we live. So how do we think about that? And it's a really sticky subject because it's very controversial, because different cultures have different approaches to that all over. But I think maybe it's that we need to be thinking about more deeply, rather than how to keep everything alive. But if things are going to die, which they are, how do we go about that in a more just, sustainable, equitable fashion? But yeah, it's that definitely Haraway actually really resonates with me. She's just an amazing person.
Yeah, I think it's an interest that also Kate expressed in her work. I think this idea of responsibility, ethics of responsibility, like the enabling responses. So it seems like we need to enable our response more than building sort of ethical fixed categories or norms, and we have to respond. But for me, it is very difficult, and it has been very difficult to sort of understand what does that mean for every aspect really of my life. And so how do you move from this sort of revelation of saying, okay, I need to respond, but how do I respond? And I think that's definitely a big challenge.
Yeah, you know, and yeah, I definitely I even see that in your work too, when you're referencing the rattlesnake. It was so this question of like, how do I not represent but respond in a way that, you know, takes into account all of this that's going on around me, without making assumptions and that sort of thing. What I take a lot of inspiration from Buddhist philosophy, and the concept of situated experience. I think too often the scale of what we're dealing with, particularly the industrial animal agricultural complex and just food, and just the way that information is submitted to us, you know, through the media, we get the sense that we are part of this giant complex of things, and we are, but it becomes so overwhelming that it's like, how do I even function? Like, what is little me going to do in this huge complex of actors and resources and environments? So I really try to bring it back to this concept of mindfulness and situated experience, and that the only things that are really going to matter is what's happening in your day-to-day experience, and why I'm saying that people are the designers of their everyday lives. And really that you have to try to take account of the network that you are personally situated in, and try with some kind of mindful intention to move forward in making more, I guess, mindful decisions. And I think kind of collectively, if everyone was doing that, you know, ideally, then it would make a more sort of collectively mindful movement of how do we move forward in wicked problems. But I really do see that as kind of the missing, like the gap is that we don't think enough. There's not enough mindfulness. Like it's you know, everything is invisible simply because we're not thinking about it or recognizing it. We're not thinking about what's on our plate or making those connections. So I think it does come down to just sort of like taking a minute and then recognizing like, hey, this thing on my plate, where did it come from? Might even just start to create more questions or more responses and say, today I'm going to be a vegetarian, or, you know, maybe I should try something new, things like that. I think people are just sort of, or we've just become sort of catatonic as consumers and just, all right, there it is. I buy it, I eat it, I go home. I mean, I'm guilty of it. I think everyone is. So yeah, it's hard to answer though. I don't think there is a universal answer. I think it comes to diversity of inputs. Yeah, like you said, there can be no fixed framework. Otherwise, it just sort of implodes on itself, I think.
Yeah, and I guess this invisibility. I mean, yeah, it's convenient, and yeah, it's convenient, and so there's it's easy not to change it, you know?
Yeah. I'm just thinking if I have something else I can kind of lob at you. So I'm just kind of going through my notes because I have so many. I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is interesting. I really did like that shot with the rattlesnake. I just brought it up, but I liked it because you mentioned you liked it, and I liked how you brought up this kind of continuing narrative about failure. But I think that was what was so inspiring about the video itself, was that you sort of just put it out there right at the beginning, like, I felt like a failure, I felt stupid, I felt confused. But then here you produced a video about it, you know, something that's supposed to, you know, produce more further thinking on like, well, what does that mean? So I think it was really cool that you sort of spotlit the concept of failure as a key way to produce knowledge. That was really inspiring for me. But I like this particular shot of the rattlesnake, and you trying to at first try to represent the rattlesnake, but then you realize like, no, I'm actually sort of representing an anthropomorphized view of what the rattlesnake I think would be seeing. And I liked how you commented that the camera became self-aware, and as in my design brain, I was thinking this is really interesting because you're talking about observing something that's observing other things, meanwhile observing itself that isn't actually alive. And I think you were talking about how you've done a lot of research into new materialism and it really brought up like Jane Bennett, who I'm sure you've read, and Vibrant Matter, and just the agency of things, and how this camera, despite not being alive, became a very key point of just discovering things and creating knowledge, not only in yourself, but then in the viewers, us, people watching the video. And I'm just thinking, like, do you now have kind of a new, maybe newfound relationship to the technology you use in your work? Like, I noticed you use a lot of cameras, but I'm sure there's lots of other things. Just kind of feeling that they're sort of self-aware.
Well, yeah, I think in terms of failure, I mean, it's one important thing to say is that it took me a while to sort of understand. I mean, right away I understood that I enjoyed the clips, that I didn't miss it, but I for a while I thought that I didn't produce any image that would be worth to show. And when I say show, I'm talking about part of the problem, thinking about artistic work as something that has to be shown, or otherwise it is not necessarily worth it, And I think that relates a lot with artistic research and about processes and thinking through art. And so, like, it took me a while that I wanted to use those videos that are to think about my practice, and that, and they did a really, they worked really well for thinking through practice, and I really like the results. So yeah, I think it took me a while, because we have the inertia, the habit of not changing the things, our fixed ideas, and that relates, I guess, with the meat as well, and so it took me a while to say, like, I have to really sort of get rid of this sort of annoying voice that it's saying you have to get it right, and so that's, I think that's, in a way, interesting. And in terms of the camera, it does comes from the snake. I mean, I had the other option was to put a camera on a snake, which is also ethical. It's even worse, I think, or well, I don't know, could bite me. So also, but really, I think I do think I am thinking in Jane Bennett's and the materialism of objects, but really always from a relational ontology, as Bennett explains. It's not, I don't imagine the sort of the camera as an autonomous sort of apparatus, that it's just sort of doing its thing, and noticing itself, and a bit as the object ontology, oriented ontology, and sort of like aloof kind of thing that goes in the world. I see it always sort of interrelated, and so yeah, I think the camera, regardless of my will to do stuff and to be an artist and use the camera to different means, regardless of how controlling I want to be, I think the camera, it enacts agency, and in this case, it was really nice to see this light that, in a way, sort of unfolds this sort of relationship to the space and to time.
I love how you talk about just the I guess, like, messiness that goes into artistic practice. And I think there is this weird tension that comes between this need to be processual and then messy, when science is constantly trying to produce sort of like this crystallized end product, and where we sort of keep returning to cleanse the mirror, right? That there was no messiness that happened, behind how we're reflecting on what we're seeing. And, I think about sort of science in relationship to design and then artistic practice, and how there has to be a process of failure in order to actually sort of achieve something. But I think that's again, the invisibility, like an invisible quality of the research that's often produced. You develop your thesis, you produce the paper, and all the messiness is suddenly gone. When I think your work in particular really highlights the necessity of that messiness in order to produce a final product. And that it's really vital to see as well, because it not only discusses the agency of like the equipment and technology you're using, but also just gives a sense of you as the researcher, like how you were talking about how you felt as though you missed the eclipse, but you didn't because you had experienced it at some point before in your life. And I found that really suddenly revealing about what you were discussing, that there was actually some kind of other connection to another eclipse that sort of eclipsed the experience, and that you were still able to feel the I guess the phenomena that was unfolding around you just by having connected to it before, which I think, in the cleansed mirror sort of manner we wouldn't see, and loses so much, I don't know, poignancy behind what you're trying to communicate. So yeah, I just found that particularly just, I don't know, awesome.
Thanks. I would add one thing that I think it relates a lot with your work and what you were saying, and Donna Haraway, of course, like about the messiness, and Haraway expresses about the idea of being a mod, a person that lives in muddy and along critters, and so this idea of sort of messiness and mud, I think it's interesting, and I thinking about that right now. I thought about this sort of conference that has Isabel Stengers, about this thing that happened with the potatoes, the genetic modified potatoes, where a scholar, I don't know, I don't remember her name, got thrown out of a university in Holland. And she makes this sort of defense towards a slow science, a science that it's not so concerned about benchmarking and about producing like lots of papers, and I think that could be sort of really interesting in terms of the design, of a problem of design, and a problem of making science that it's also messy, and I think that's really important. I think there's a lot for science to, I guess, I don't know, I don't make science, but it seems to me that there should be a lot to learn from this sort of messiness processes.
Yeah, the more I think about it, I feel like, we sort of exclude the mess from these final products of science, that science almost feels reductive in a way, that it's obliterated almost all of the process behind it that has produced some kind of answer or some kind of final result that is very interesting and enlightened. But I just think about all of the rest, like the trail of mess that has to happen before we get there. I think there needs to be more attention brought to that. I think there could be greater understanding fostered there. Like maybe if people really knew the I don't know, the pathway to discovering something, whether it's how to document phenomena, or how to eat cleaner, or how a vaccine is made, like all of these things. I think maybe there would be a greater understanding about what the technologies or the ethics or the concepts we're talking about really mean. But we're so focused on not having anything messy and having everything in a neat little box. And I don't know, I always find that when you discuss messiness or chaos, people are like, whoa, I don't know how to deal with that, it's scary. And maybe that's just because we haven't thought about it hard enough. I don't know.
I'd just like to jump in here and say just I don't feel I want to because this conversation is amazing. So I feel terrible for interrupting, but I just would really like to open it out to see if anyone in the audience or anyone else has questions for you, because this is such a fascinating, both of you talking about such fascinating areas. So I think Sharid, welcome Sharid. You have your hand raised. Is that for a question?
Thank you very much. Good day, everybody. Right, so you were speaking about the whole notion of an artist given representation to the quantum. I like to intervene in the dialogue, and I say that you're right on track, and say that it's how artists give representation to the quantum, to the acausal, how they give representation to this beauty. What I think they do is they are involved in a subtle transformation of phenomena that's bound or tamed within that mask of causality. And that causality is actually linked to our static logic of perception. Our perception is how we perceive things is linked to that cause and effect reality that we are conditioned into. And I'd like to bring into play the whole notion of where you talked about reversing non-vision into vision. How do you give representation to the invisible, right? And so basically, this is what happens with some artists, why they just don't have that capacity to give representation to things that are beyond our capacity of seizure, beyond our levels of representation. It's because the quantum, in the first place, it has its own exactitude, an exactitude that's very different from how we interpret exactitude, because our type of exactitude is based on objective criteria. So what happens with some artists is that they tend to confuse that sort of quantum exactitude, which we interpret as inexactitude, with a static logic or particularity. And this tends to breed narrative, this tends to be artistic reflections of an environment that's really passive, that's not alive, when it's really, it's a complex intricacy of living things, right? So I just like to add, and that's what happens, I think, with some artists when they get trapped in that complacent habit of perception. You were also looking at the whole notion of the science versus artistic practice. And what I like to say is that the problem is that science, when scientists are steeped in objective criteria, they become more or less fallible, especially when they realize that this objective criteria is really a mask for hidden diversities, and those sort of hidden diversities, and this is where the messiness, where you're talking about the indeterminacy, that chaos comes in, because those hidden diversities really an interfusion of tangible and intangible bodies interfused. So I think that that's the issue with when scientists, that's the issue that science actually has with the artistic discipline. It's because they are trapped in that mask of objective criteria. And once they are conditioned within to give representation to that sort of, within that criteria, it's very difficult for them to transfer or to translate the intangible into their realities. So I think that's what really happens with the scientific disciplines. However, if once those concrete limits are deactivated, I think that there could be a translation. That is where the artist actually comes in, because where science can't give a representation to those realities, the artist is able to bridge that gap, right? So, and that's what I like to share. And you were very right on track by bringing up those issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sharid. That's that's cosmic stuff. A lot there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely agree with you that there's science and art can work together to create this kind of bridge. But there's definitely a lot to bridge, I suppose.
I think it's a lot. There's a lot to bridge, but it's coming closer. I think, at least on thinking about these ontological sort of or ethical ontologies, both in science and art. I mean, it seems like that we might have a sort of a tool, at least, to sort of bring that gap closer. No?
Basically, you're translating the untranslatable. And speaking about bridging, I think that Karen Barad actually fits within that bridge, because she was actually steeped into the objective criteria. And what happened is that she has branched across into philosophy, because I think that she has realized that along with other scientists who have crossed over into the artistic domain, she has realized that objective status is suddenly breached, and because of that, she has to give representation. So that's why she turns to philosophy, she turns to art. So, and she's not the only one. There are others. I think way back, when you look at especially those scientists who were steeped into quantum physics, people like Niels Bohr, you know, they actually brought this whole issue of bringing the qualitative into the quantitative, which is it's just, you know, I mean, there were a handful of people, but they had probably suspected that these sort of things, you have to find a way to give representation to. I mean, Einstein, when he spoke about the quantum, he said it was spooky action at a distance. I mean, you know, so that alone says that, you know, these scientists who are actually steeped in representing things based on strict numbers, they were actually also looking at these suspected parallels with the artistic domain. So, you know, but now you have people like Karen Barad, you have other people. The writer I'm studying for my thesis, he was actually a hydraulic engineer. So what he had realized that his training in mathematics, his training in hydraulic engineering, just could not give representation to that to this sort of reality, the reality of what he calls the living landscape, so the physical environment. So he actually had to infuse a shamanistic psychology into the quantum physics in order to give representation. And I think he did a pretty good job at it. His name is Wilson Harris. He's from Guyana. And so you should get you should take a look at his books, especially his set of novels called the Carnival Trilogy. It deals with those sort of issues. How do you give representation to the quantum? So, and he is actually, well, one of the many novelists who actually give, who's involved in that sort of thing. So, yes, things are changing, and scientists and artists are actually working together, you know, and I think that's, you know, the bridge has been gapped. Yeah.
Thanks, Sharid. Thanks. We've got just a few minutes left of your conversation, Ali and Emilio, and I just wanted to reflect to you a couple of the comments also that we have in the chat. And Colette has said that she's loving the idea of including the messiness, the failures, and the potential of so much knowledge contained in the chaos. And then Sandy says, I see the humanity and how we interconnect in everything we do in both these bodies of research. So some really nice comments there in the chat. And just in the last couple of minutes, if anyone else has a question for Ali or Emilio, any raised hands? Or
oh, there's Nick.
Hi, Nick.
Yeah,
yeah, hi. That was really, really interesting. Thank you both so much. And I don't know if this is just going to be repetitive, but at the end of your presentation, Emilio, you were talking about touching, or like kind of touching this experience. And I thought that was a really interesting way to think about, and it sort of relates to kind of how do we see the invisible and how do we sense the insensible, and how do you touch something like this eclipse experience that you can't touch and yet you exactly are touching. And I guess it just made me think about Karen Barad's, she has a paper that's called Touching the Inhuman, That Therefore I Am. And one of the beautiful things that I find in there is like this very poetic description of, the fact that what we experience as touch is actually just space, and it's actually energy and the repulsion between electrons. And for me, what I like about that is that it just has to kind of keep my understanding continually unsettled about what experience is and what things are. And I guess I really feel that in your in your work, Emilio, especially, but in both of your work. So I don't know. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in there.
Sure. Thanks a lot. I think, and I'll borrow one of the things you said, like this sort of like estranging of touching, because when we think about touching, we think about something very different that what Barad says in that text, and what I'm trying to think about these other forms of touching, and I started thinking about touching not only because of reading Barad, but also like I saw the astronomers, like using these powerful machines to detect light that we cannot see. It's a radio millimeter wavelength energy that it's coming from millions of years back into the past, far away in time and space, and it goes through the telescope and then hits the sensor, and in a way it touches light somehow, and it touches astronomers, and it is not a kind of touch that is not the usual thing when we think about touching. So that also sort of I started thinking about how could we sort of think about touching differently, and intimately, even despite the distance. Sorry, but go ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just thinking it is a really inspiring thought and question, and I guess we kind of like anthropocentrize what experience is, and I think we just do that by default. But I think Emilio's presentation in particular really gives you pause to think, like, well, how do planets, how do celestial bodies experience touch? Particularly as you said, Nick, that's a repulsion, right? Even if we put our hands together, they're not actually touching, but we have this like assumption that that's what touching is. But if a planet is so huge, maybe it touches from a very, very far, like a very great distance. So yeah, it sends the mind spinning for sure.
On that fantastic thoughts, I think we have come to the end of our first day of the Multiple Ecologies, Diverse Ontologies Symposium. So what a wonderful thought for us all to leave with. So thanks Ali and Emilio there for your presentation. Thank you, Nick, for our conversation, which was wonderful, and thank you to our presenters, Karini, Laura, and Isaiah from earlier today. So thanks everyone for a wonderful first day of the symposium.
Thanks a lot to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. See you tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Congratulations for the wonderful discussions. Really interesting, really deep. And I must say, I learned a lot today. Thank you so much for you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. We don't have much to say at the end today. Anybody that wants to turn on their camera now, that just to say thank you, you're more than welcome to. This has been amazing. I couldn't have asked for a better first day. Tomorrow we have more great conversations coming up, so hopefully we'll see most of you there. But we will try to continue conversation in various ways. I think the Google Doc is a way. If anybody has other ideas of how we can continue this, I'm definitely open to these. So I really, because I said this is one of the things I miss about real, like in-person conferences is the meeting in the hallways and the, cocktail hours and the dance party, which, definitely was my, always one of my favorite parts of any conference. Although those varied a lot in quality. But so any way that you can, anyone has ideas to think of how we can sort of continue this, to not replicate, but to change and make, a different connections and ways, I'm open to them, and I'd be really excited by this, because we do live in a different world than we did, 2 years ago, and it's going to continue changing in various ways, and we need to adapt, and we need to adapt in different ways, and we don't just try to, I think everyone here agrees we don't need to just go back to the way things were. And so this conference is for this, and it's for, connecting with each other, but also sort of learning how to deal with this changing world. And part of that is how to do, how to communicate with each other in different ways, how to connect, getting on an airplane and going to a conference, while fun, is terrible for the environment. And this is a way of doing it, but how can we bring some of that with us? So anyways, if anybody else has anything else to say.
You said there was a Google Doc already?
There's not yet. That was suggested
I don't know.
today. And yeah, no, it was just suggested today. So I think I will start one after the symposium. So, and share it with everyone. So if anyone else, Kate, Colette.
I just have been so impressed, and I've learned so much, and I've been blown away by all of your work and your research. Thank you. Thank you. That's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Same from me. Just thank you, everyone. Just so many ideas and so many notes that I've scribbled down, and things to follow up, and reading to do, and yeah, it's just been wonderful. And just the rich conversations, I think, have been, it's such a lovely way to hold a symposium, I think, from, just hearing people's presentations to actually hearing us kind of respond to each other's research in a more kind of, in a deeper and more considered way. I think it had to have the space to do that. I think it's been a really fantastic thing. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all. So, okay. Well, if anyone else has anything we can do, otherwise we will see tomorrow. We get new presenters tomorrow, and very exciting. So thank you all so much for day one. So
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. See you tomorrow. Thank you.
Tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.